terms of his republic, he talks about, he has this system of child care, a system where he thinks that the leadership, he writes that the leadership, called the guardians they call them, the kind of the leading class, that they should take, well, first of all, he encourages eugenics, meaning breeding, like having certain people breed together to produce the best offspring. And then, but then even among those people, and some of the people aren't, like, he has this thing where it's like a group of people decide who's supposed to mate with each other, and they kind of like keep it a secret that some people among the kind of leading class don't get to mate with somebody else. But then when the babies are born, the babies are taken, I think it's at 4 days, from their parents and then reared together in a common nursery, so that they all get kind of good and equal kind of upbringing and nurturing from the early days of life. And in fact, once the infant is taken from the mom after birth, then the mom isn't allowed to know. They keep it a secret who the kid is, the actual kid is of that mom. So the idea is, like I said, making sure that the nurturing is the same for these kids who are going to be the leading class and also of high quality. Well, that's true. The kibbutz in Israel, the kibbutz is a setting that is actually in ways similar. I mean, it was motivated more for religious reasons, but people trying to develop the ideal society. There were kind of subcultures within, well, once it became Israel, but in that area, Jewish families bonding together to try to build an ideal society for their, and not just an ideal, and a part of the ideal society was a very gender equality-based society, where both men and women participated in work equally, and they took different steps to make sure the education of men and women were equal. And they actually developed, and this was a movement. I mean, it still exists, but it's kind of changed form, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So like early in the 20th century, they started forming kibbutz, and they're very agriculturally based as well. Farming was a priority, and so they set up a system where typically they all could have slightly different rules depending on the kibbutz, but the idea was that kids from early in life would be reared together in a dorm together. I mean, orphanage, we call it that, but typically orphanage, they think of have kind of negative connotations, but a communal care center, and allowed to see their parents or parents allowed to see them maybe 2 to 3 hours a day, and not at nighttime necessarily, maybe in the late afternoons. Now they know who their kids are. It wasn't as extreme as Plato was talking about. And again, the idea was having these kids that are reared under good conditions. By doing that, they allowed women, the women in the kibbutz would take turns rotating, being the kind of caregiver at the center, which would allow other women to kind of take on jobs, agriculture jobs, other kind of jobs on the kibbutz, so that kind of more professional quality could be reached. Well, and in fact, in terms of child outcomes, that's one of the kind of places that when the book talks about that, it's talking about the kibbutz son, which is that infants were, in fact, I think I might have mentioned these as well in class, at some point, able to form multiple attachments. They did, in fact, form attachments to their parents, but also to whoever that primary caregiver was. So it didn't seem to necessarily have detrimental outcomes for the kid's social development. However, these high ideals that motivated the kibbutz, changes have occurred in the last 30 years, 40 years. Well, actually, it's always been changing some throughout the century or last century. But in terms of whether that ideal would work, women, the good ideals about kind of equality of women in professional jobs, but women were demanding more and more in different kibbutzes more time with their infants. They didn't like being separated from their infants for all but a couple hours of the day. And the truth is, my understanding from what I've read, I've never been on a kibbutz. Has anybody been on a kibbutz before? No? Really? Oh, okay. This ideal of equality was actually never totally reached. That, women were in jobs, but early on they had to kind of prove that they could do the kind of physical labor related to the agriculture, certain types of jobs, like tilling and things like that required a little more physical strength. And that through the years, even though they were all equally in jobs, the jobs that women got weren't the same. These agricultural jobs were seen as the higher prestige jobs, and women were more doing kind of making clothes and things like that. So there was never full equality. But the women were demanding more and more time with their kids. So this high ideal sounded good, but it wasn't exactly what the women decided that they wanted, that they needed more individual time with their kids. And this is exactly what attachment theorist John Bowlby would have predicted, or would predict. That not just, this attachment is not just in the babies, the need to attach and find security in their caregivers, but it's also that we're evolutionarily evolved to kind of have mechanisms in us as caregivers, and especially possibly women, to kind of take care of and need that kind of face-to-face time with kids. So in answer to the question, would it work? It might work in terms of, it could work in terms of social outcomes for the kids, but logistically it would be difficult to have this kind of setting, because I think the women in particular in a society would demand kind of more face-to-face time and evening time with their kids. Today we're going to talk about attachment. We're going to talk, you read about it some. We're going to talk about a couple different questions related to attachment. What is it? Where does it come from? What does it mean for our development? And that's it. We're going to skip the fourth question. John Bowlby, you read about him. He's the founder of attachment theory. He was a psychoanalyst. That means he was psychoanalysis is Freudian, meaning the kind of ideas of thinking that Freud started, and it still exists today. Looking into the psyche and the unconscious, trying to figure out conflicts. Not exactly the way of thinking that most psychologists have now, but he was influenced by this. Bowlby. He wrote in the 50s and the 60s. And he started by reviewing kind of orphanages after World War II. Parents who had died because of the war or for whatever reason couldn't take care of their infants, and looking at how did the kids turn out in those situations, in those settings. And he found that often the first 6 months of life, or kids that were as early as 6 months of life, reared in the orphanage, seemed fine, but then developed a lot of symptoms even in infancy, later in infancy. Severely retarded, abnormal social behaviors, kind of not interacting, not kind of consistent interactions with caregivers, often unresponsive to the caregivers, or even depressed, or poor appetite. Appetite suppression is often a characteristic of kind of anxiety or depression. And then as they got older, they often stole and were more aggressive. Now, this isn't necessarily all of the kids that became aggressive, but more than you would expect. After World War II, conditions in these types of orphanages that countries put together often improved, largely because of some of the early writings and the early work, such that there was more stimulation, like more caregivers and more kind of cognitive stimulation to develop kids' cognitive abilities. And so then in the 70s, like another review of orphanages found that the cognitive development actually looked better than what Bowlby originally wrote about, but that in fact still these social outcomes were not so right. They were sometimes overly friendly with strangers. They often lacked close relationships with caregivers. They had a hard time developing intimacy. And again, in school they were unpopular, disobedient, and so why are different reasons why they weren't getting along well with other kids? Well, so why is that? Bowlby was, in thinking about these things, like I said, Bowlby was influenced by Freud, but he never totally believed this kind of unconscious stuff that Freud talked about. Freud talked about the oral stage and the infant's ability to reconcile the oral stage. Like Freud and actually some others after Freud talked about the infant and like breastfeeding. And if there's a problem with the relationship with the caregiver and you're not breastfeeding normally, this kind of oral, if you're not reconciled about where to get your nourishment from, that's going to have problems for you later. Well, now we don't really believe in these kind of the oral anal stages that Freud talked about, or the long-term implications of things he was talking about. Bowlby was influenced by that, but also turned to pathologists. Conrad Lorenz, who we talked about him, the guy with the geese. You probably know him from Psych 100. That in geese, when they come out of that egg, the first thing they see, it's called imprinting. They'll follow the first thing they see, and it seems to be an evolutionary adaptation. Certain mechanisms that are similar to what the geese have. So you've seen probably a video of Lorenz walking around with 8 ducks or geese falling around him, because they've imprinted him as the attachment figure. And then also at the same time, Harry Harlow, who we saw the video of Mother Love about, was talking about attachment and doing his studies on the rhesus monkeys. And kind of providing some data that maybe it's not about, even from early in life, our attachment to caregivers isn't about food, so much as kind of a more emotional thing, an emotional attachment that has to do with calming down and feeling security in the world. So let me give you a definition of attachment. An enduring emotional tie between the infant and the caregiver. It evolved for survival, including finding food, but also protection. And it's an attempt, in a sense, by the infant to maintain close contact with the caregiver. Bowlby saw the infant as manipulators of the caregiver in ways. That it's not just that caregivers want to take care of the kid, but the kid is doing things, and that we've evolved to do things to keep people close to us, to do these functions of the attachment figure. So, for example, crying. We read about emotions and crying as a distress signal. Why did we evolve to cry? Well, this is physical discomfort, and that we seem to have a kind of natural reaction to hearing crying that keeps us close to infants. Smiles we talked about as indicating a social bond. We not just an infant smile, but any smile kind of pulls us in. Now we can, as kind of people with kind of cognitive control, we can walk away from that infant or that person who's smiling. But there is a little something there that tends to pull us in with the smile. It seems to evolve to kind of pull us into groups more. Bowlby also talked about something called the Cupid doll effect. Does anybody know what the Cupid doll is? I think it was a doll in the 50s apparently. The idea is that maybe there are even physical features of infants that bring us in. You know, when we see like TV, they have TV videos of like animal pets, and we're like, oh, that's cute. You know, like these little pets doing stuff. But same thing with infants. We're like, oh, it makes us soft. Like, oh, that's cute. Well, maybe that's not just something we've learned about like liking infants and caring for them, but maybe there's actually something about physical features. And you know, we've seen that, like the book we talked about how the head is bigger, but there's also kind of more rounded features, more fat contact proportionally with younger infants, and it seems to be there's some truth to it across species, and that maybe, in fact, the very physical features of the kids are pulling us in as well and keeping us close contact. Now, I don't know of good research that really has pinpointed whether this is true or not. This effect is true, as opposed to the idea that, like I was just saying a minute ago, certainly throughout life we learn associations when we see little innocent things. You know, we learn to kind of associate good things with that. So is it just that rounded features, or we somehow evolved to kind of protect rounded features? I don't think we, you know, feel protective of basketballs and things like that. So it's probably not just the physical characteristics that are driving that. Reflexes, the reflexes you read about, again, being held on to, the grasping reflex, the rooting reflex, where we go like this, kind of that touch, and that need for touch is something that pulls us together and keeps ways in which infants are kind of manipulating us to hold on to them. We like holding infants. It feels good for us. And they certainly are often trying to get us to touch them. What does attachment do? There's two main things. Safe haven in times of danger and a secure base for exploration. How does attachment develop? Actually, in a study with Scottish infants 30 years ago, people logged Schaefer and Emerson. Well, what's the development of this attachment system? And people who have spent time with infants probably can relate to these things. And the question is, like, well, a couple of questions. Do infants seem to care whether it's people taking care of them or not people? These are the kind of things they were looking at. And do they seem to have a preference for one person over another? I think I already mentioned this to you. But so, for example, in the very early parts of life, it's called the asocial stage, meaning infants don't seem to really care one way or another if a human's holding them or not. You know, they're still kind of just blobs sitting there. And now, yeah, I mean, so that it's not clear that, you know, in terms of development and reaching out and things like that, that hasn't developed. But then fairly quickly, 1.5 months into it, they do seem to want to, you know, these attachments seem to develop. They start reaching for people, mom, dad, whomever. But it's so they want human contact, but it doesn't necessarily matter which human they are. But then 7 to 9 months, specific attachments, meaning, and it starts with one. They want an attachment with its primary caregiver. But then it quickly changes to multiple attachments as well, so that you can start noticing, you know, when somebody else picks up little Mikey, that Mikey cries, you know, maybe at 8 months or 7 months or something like that. And you know, so then you can kind of tell, oh, all of a sudden there's a preference for somebody over another. But then quickly as they get comfortable, then, you know, they don't cry when dad picks them up or when uncle picks them up or aunt picks them up. They have the ability to kind of form multiple attachments and have kind of security in that first attachment to do so. And this maps on to, we've already talked about this, What does this map onto? Specific attachment? Cognitively? What do we talk about that this kind of overlaps with? Why would specific attachments develop at about this time? Well, not recognize, but what? Memory development, and particularly related to object permanence, meaning mom leaves the room, and if she still exists or not when she leaves the room. So the ability to have a preference is kind of dependent on memory to some extent. So that's why people think that around that time, specific attachments develop. Does every infant develop attachment to the caregiver in the same way? Bowlby, by the way, says attachment is a universal process. So like we saw the video of the strange situation and talked about, and you read about insecurely attached infants. But it's worth noting that there's still an attachment there. The processes of attachment still exist. It's just that because of the relationship and the history and temperament possibly, that the processes developed a little differently, such that we call it insecure. But it's still the case that every infant seems to have the attachment built into it and desires attachment in a similar way. And we saw the strange situation. You read about the strange situation. You didn't see the whole thing, but it has 9 different episodes. And the kind of questions that it looks at in terms of making this distinction between secure and insecure. How does the infant react to the caregiver when she leaves and when she returns? How does the infant react to the stranger that's in the room? And how much does the infant explore the toys? And based on these things, there's a coding scheme that psychologists use to develop, to label people as securely or insecurely attached, and if they're insecurely attached, there's different categories of it. So, for example, actively explores when the toys that are placed in the room. Separation is upsetting. If you remember the kid and the infant in the video we saw, mom left the room twice. And both times, and that was a kid who ended up getting securely attached as a category. But both times the kid was upset, and the second time even more so than the first. So it's not that kids are ambivalent about mom leaving the room, they are upset. The difference is more about when mom comes back into the room. How does kids react to that? Does kids still kind of cling for mom or not, reach for mom, and then seem soothed by that, or is the kind of kid irreconcilable? Most kids, about 2/3 in different studies come up with slightly different numbers, but of 1-year-olds, most kids end up being securely, within the category of securely attached. In the strange situation, you only use up to about 2 years. You don't use it past that. There's different things to assess older than 2 years. Insecure resistant are the kind of anxious kids in a sense. They explore toys a little bit, so the security the mom provides doesn't seem to lead to them to kind of like check out things more. Separation is very distressing. You'll see more crying on average among those kids. And they definitely they want the mom to come back, but but they kind of seem to hold it against the mom as well. So you might see kind of crawling closer to the mom, but at the same time then maybe not reaching up, or being, or like I said, being kind of not being soothed at all. So there's ways in which the kid, it's kind of interpretation, but it seems, people talk about it, sometimes it seems like the kid is kind of trying to hold it against the mom, or at least just not reconcilable. Smaller number of American kids fall into this category. I talked about the cultural differences, or we talked about that briefly. like Japanese society, the numbers of secure kids are similar, but in terms of types of insecure, many more kids from Asian societies fall into this category. And we talked about how the strange situation is particularly strange for kids from Japan or other societies, which might account for some of that. The avoiding kids are kind of just seen maybe a little more emotionally distant overall. The strangers don't seem to bother them, so that seems like a good thing in general. It's okay that they're good with strangers. But when mom leaves, they're not as distressed by that. And then when mom comes back, they might not kind of crawl over to her or dad. Again, more American children fall into this category. And in at least in Germany, northern Germany, studies that have been done there, they're kind of similar to this, if not a little bit higher, in fact, over there of avoiding kids. Disorganized attachment is the greatest level, and it doesn't really fit a consistent pattern of how kids behave. And it represents the smallest kind of percentage. Ainsworth didn't initially have this category, and some later attachment researchers added this idea of disorganized attachment. So if you hear about it, you might always not hear about, like if you hear somebody talking about it, you might not always hear them talking about this fourth category, because a lot of studies don't include it. But this is a category like in abusive situations. There's the majority of kind of physically abused kids would fall into this. And the idea is that the kid doesn't know how to respond to these events, these emotionally upsetting events. The attachment figure is both loved and feared at the same time, so that it kind of leaves the kid unsure what to do, like it says here, maybe freeze. So these attachment styles, you read about them, and I just kind of gave a quick description of them too. Where do you think they come from? If a kid is insecure resistant or insecure ambivalent versus a securely attached kid, where does that come from? Is that because of the way the parent has handled the kid? Or is that maybe something about the child's temperament? I wanted to present a study that kind of shows that, an experiment that shows that. It was done in the Netherlands. It's cited a lot by attachment researchers for the idea that parenting is critical. A lot of people, like in psychology, there's kind of parent researchers and temperament researchers, and sometimes the temperament researchers kind of, not most of them, but a few of them might say things like they think temperament drives these kind of things more than parenting does. But this study does a pretty good job showing that parenting matters, but it also shows that temperament matters as well. At-risk infants were identified based on their temperament, and these are all from lower income families as well. That's what SES means, socioeconomic status, low socioeconomic status, or lower income. Infants were identified as irritable at 2 weeks, meaning they were just more easily distressed by kind of things. Anyway, we can do little tests to see how reactive a kid is to kind of things that happen, and that's a proxy for how irritable the kid is. So that was identified very early in the kid's life. Of those kids, at 6 months, this was an intervention with psychologists and helpers of the psychologist. Half of them had an intervention with parents, and the other half did not. And well, I'll tell you in a second what it is, but that intervention was about kind of being responsive, identifying the kid's needs. You know, when a kid was crying or maybe overstimulated, how to identify that, and then how to respond to that in terms of kind of smiling at the kid more often and things like that. Well, at 9 months, if nothing happened, only 28% of the kids were securely attached. So this actually kind of, well, you don't know exactly, but and that 28% is obviously less than than the numbers I put up for American kids, and that would be true of the Netherlands kids, what percentage are normally securely attached. So you could look at that and say, oh, maybe temperament does make some of the difference. If nothing, if the kind of normal development occurs with this kid with the irritable temperament, most of them won't be securely attached. Although you don't know what the parent's doing in that case. But of the ones who got this intervention, 62% were securely attached at 9 months. So 28% versus 62%. So that's what, a difference of 34%. So a third more kids were securely attached at 9 months if they got this parenting intervention. So definitely shows that parenting makes a difference, and that training and parenting skills can make a difference. At the same time, it's not 100%. And that could either be, well, maybe some of the parents didn't actually learn the skills that the psychologists were trying to train them, or maybe there is that temperament, maybe that irritable temperament. Maybe it's really difficult unless you're just an exceptional parent, even if you get training, to kind of develop that kind of attachment relationship. Also found that moms more positive, meaning kind of smiling more at the kids, responding more sensitively to things. Infants more sociable and kind of like when you put toys out or put more with other infants or other caregivers in terms of exploring.